The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This is Danny Bobrow, President of AIM Dental Marketing, welcoming you to this installment of the Practice Perfection web-based education series. Today's presentation is entitled 50 Tips to Protect Your Practice and Your Reputation. The HIPAA privacy and security rules have recently upped the ante for fines relating to the security and privacy of protected health information, or PHI. As a healthcare provider, you're required to prove you have implemented administrative, technical, and physical safeguards within your practice. Jeff Broudy is a leader in HIPAA compliance and patient data protection. He is the CEO of PCI Hippo, which specializes in helping medical and dental practices mitigate risks relating to HIPAA requirements and data protection quickly, easily, and affordably. He has assembled a team of experts including certified risk advisors, customer success specialists, and HIPAA lawyers. Most recently, PCI Hippo was endorsed by the American Association of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgeons, as well as the American Osteopathic Association, to help their members navigate HIPAA law and protect patient data. Since 2012, PCI Hippo's Office Safe compliance program has helped protect thousands of medical and dental practices nationwide. While navigating HIPAA law can feel overwhelming, by the end of today's session, you will learn about the top requirements and vulnerabilities surrounding HIPAA compliance and data breach protection. You'll also leave with several steps you can implement today to protect your practice and your reputation. I've seen the presentation slides, and when Jeff promises 50 tips, he means 50 tips. So be ready for that. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you that Practice Perfection webcasts run for 90 minutes. While attendees are in listen-only mode, we invite you at any time to submit your questions or comments using the question button on your screen. We will allow time following the presentation to answer your questions. If we don't get to your particular question during the webcast, we will ensure that it is answered shortly following. Attendance at this presentation entitles you to apply to receive 1.5 hours of continuing education credit. Shortly following the webcast, you will be emailed a brief survey with instructions on how to receive your CE. Participants are cautioned about the dangers of incorporating techniques and procedures into their practices if the course has not provided them with adequate clinical experience to allow them to perform it competently. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome to the Practice Perfection stage, Jeff Broudy. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Danny, and
Sure thing.
I appreciate everyone spending their either early evening or late afternoon with us. I'm hoping to. My goal is really, I know 50 tips can sound like a lot and can sound like a long time. My intent is that you just walk away with something that you can take away. You're not going to remember all 50 tips. Danny, I'm sure, will send everybody the tips and what we're going over so that they can start to look at it. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed. I just want to have a dialogue about some of the things that we're seeing and what we're doing to help practices. A little bit on who PCI Hippo is. This is our pat me on the back slide. I promise I won't do too much of this, but we have to do a little bit of it just so you get some background.
Well, you got to get to the 50 tips, right? And yeah, I did want to remind everybody too that this is being recorded, and everybody who registered for the webcast will receive an archive. So you can really sit back, relax, and just soak it up, knowing that you'll be able to refer to the 50 tips at your leisure later too.
Yeah, I didn't want people to freak out and say they have to write everyone down. And some of them may resonate, some of them won't, and that's the whole purpose of it. But the pat on the back slide is, PCI Hippo was founded back in 2012, so we've been doing this for over 5 years. We have over 2,000 practices on our Office Safe compliance program. And as Danny mentioned, we've been endorsed by the American Association of Oral Maxillofacial Surgeons, the American Osteopathic Association. We deal with education leaders like SPEAR and LVI. And, the reason I'll say kind of at a high level on why we've been endorsed and why we're growing and why we have thousands of practices is, you know, HIPAA, which I'll get into a little bit. I feel like their intent is really spot on a number of occasions, and what their intent is to do and how to actually help the industry as a whole. I think it's difficult for them to execute because they're trying to solve for a small to mid-sized practice, and that's the target that we focus on. We're trying to help that small to mid-sized practice, and the laws govern not only a dental practice, a medical practice, but also a hospital. And I think that's been the challenge, to try to, you know, a medical practice or a dental practice that has one location, has 20 employees, or a couple locations and 30 or 40 employees, trying to do everything that you're trying to do, which is really treating patients, but also covering the HIPAA law, has been what we've heard has been very difficult. And many practices that we speak with just don't have the bandwidth to really focus on HIPAA. They do to a certain extent, but they're not sure of the law. They give it to their office manager. And so what we've tried to do at PCI Hippo is really bring together tools and services to streamline HIPAA compliance and to protect patient data. And we've assembled a team that helps practices do that. And that, again, that's all we focus on every single day, is helping practices solve that pain point. So let me talk a little bit. I'm not going to get into, this isn't going to be a HIPAA safeguard discussion, but I do feel like I need to touch upon where these laws come from and at a high level what you're required to do before I start digging into some of the details. And then before I actually get into the 50 tips, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like and what we're seeing and what's really practical that's happening out there. There's a lot of news surrounding HIPAA and patient information, and I want to make you aware of that. But HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. If anyone that is providing HIPAA services for you and they spell it HIPPA as opposed to HIPAA, they're making a mistake. We see a lot of people spelling it with two T's like the regular HIPAA. That's not what it is. It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was enacted in 1996 for incremental health reform, and their intent was to reduce costs, to simplify the administrative processes, and to improve the privacy and security of patient information. Professionally, I feel like the last sentence is the most important, in improving that privacy and security of patient information. That's what I'm going to focus on. The reduction of costs and simplification, I think, has been a challenge because of what I mentioned before. They're trying to solve for everybody. But it's really key that you, as a professional in the healthcare industry, really focus on what am I doing as a practice to protect my patient information. And that's what HIPAA is really intending to do with their enactment of the omnibus rule and a lot of the safeguards that they've implemented. These safeguards and HIPAA law is enforced by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office for Civil Rights. And we're seeing a lot more scrutiny, a lot more governance, and a lot more fines and regulation because the industry just hasn't acted quickly enough to really protect the information that's out there. And I think also technology is driving some of those risks and some of the implications that many in the industry aren't 100% aware of. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So there are three categories of safeguards: administrative, technical, and physical. And again, I promise not to get into the details. I included a lot on these three slides because I want you to, at least when we send you the presentation, you can get a little bit more of a feeling of, okay, what am I doing? What am I not doing? Where are some of the areas that I'm good at? And what am I not good at? The administrative safeguards really focus on the actions around policies and procedures to manage that protected health information that you have in your office. And some of the requirements under that are you need policies and procedures up to date. You have to sign a HIPAA security and privacy officer, and you have to have a business associate agreements in place. Again, HIPAA requires a lot of proof. So you have to have it in writing, it has to be documented, and you have to really show that you're developing a culture of compliance for your practice. Some of the technical safeguards relate to electronic protected health information, which we call EPHI. EPHI, the electronic part, is covered under the HIPAA security rule. All information, either written or in electronic form, is covered under the HIPAA privacy rule, but both are really important. So the technical part is really focused on the HIPAA security rule, and again, some of the technical safeguards are making sure that you have usernames and passwords on your computers, making sure you understand who's accessing and who's logging in and off of your workstations, and that you're putting the proper protections in place for firewalls, for example, so hackers can't get into your system, and you're using encryption to protect your information. So very technical, obviously, but a lot of things that the practice needs to be aware of. This is probably the page that you work with your IT provider to make sure that they're helping you with a lot of the technical safeguards required. And then the final group is physical safeguards. So physical is just, making sure that anyone that has access to your building, access to your workstations, that you're keeping them locked, that your data backups are stored in the proper place, that there's fireproof safeguards in place, cabinets are locked wherever there's protected health information, and just making sure that you're doing what you need to safeguard. Each one of these safeguards, there's layers of this, but again, I wanted to keep this at a high level. If you were an enterprise or a hospital, you would have a risk officer that went through in detail every one of these standards, and you would make sure that you had everything checked off in place. It's my belief that for a practice, a medical or dental practice, that's a small to mid-sized business, that they should be aware of these safeguards. But from a business level, we at PCI Hippo will help you think practically, and I've helped our clients think practically on the best way to approach making sure that these safeguards in place. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to mitigate risk. This HIPAA compliance is a risk mitigation play. And what I mean by that is that you can go in, for example, and you can hire a full-time person, and all they're doing is thinking about HIPAA for, let's say, your dental practice. But is that really practical for you to have a full-time employee just focusing on HIPAA? My opinion, no, but you do need someone that's thinking about it every day, but not their full-time job. But you have to start instilling this. And the risk areas, it's kind of balancing. How much insurance should I have? How much employee manpower should I implement? What are my real risks? And then you take those business risks and you figure out how much resources to spend. But the areas of risk that you really have to focus on and consider are non-compliance. So let's say I decide to do nothing. That's a choice of yours. You can say, I'm not going to do anything. I don't believe in HIPAA. I'm not going to do anything. I don't really care what you're saying. I'm kind of here for the CE credits. That's all I really care about. That's your decision. You're entitled to do that. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd recommend that you start doing something, but non-compliance is definitely a risk, because it's not just an audit, and we are seeing audits, but it's not just an audit. It could be a patient that complains about something that happened in your practice, and then the Health and Human Services and the Office for Civil Rights will come look. And if they come and look at a practice on the date of the complaint, if there's nothing in place, if you've done nothing, your risk will go up. If you've done something and are showing that you're developing a culture of compliance, then your risk will go down. And you may not have everything in place, and that's okay. But at least you're starting to develop that culture of compliance. So non-compliance risk is, yes.
When you say you're at risk, risk for what? Risk of fines from the feds?
Yeah, it's risk of fines, which I'll get into. So definitely practices are getting fined and business associates are getting fined. But it's also risk, and number three, these lead up to the reputational risk of the practice. So if you have a data breach, for example, which is risk number two, if you have a data breach or you lose patient information, there's things that you have to do. You actually have to publish a press release. And if you
Yeah.
publish a press release in your area, you have reputational risk because your patients are going to read it and they're going to see that their patient information was breached.
I guess
And
the point that
again,
I wanted to make, I wanted to confirm, which is that I think it's the risk number one here on your slide, which is that, you know, you might say chances are, whatever they are, that you'll never be hit with a breach, you'll never be hit with, you know, any kind of a ransomware or anything. But if you're hit with a random audit and you haven't shown at least a commitment to compliance, then that risk is going to be realized. That's going to hit you in the form of a fine, right? Because they're not just going to say, okay, well, I don't see anything. You know, you're not doing anything, but you haven't been hacked, so we don't care. Obviously, they do care.
yeah, I think that's good. That's you're spot on. 1 and 2 lead to 3. So if you're non-compliant, you have a potential financial risk of being fined. If you have a data breach or a loss, you have a potentially risks of being fined, risks of financial risks of curing those breaches, and then reputational risk in your practice. So, you know, these 1 and 2 leads to 3, and it's really important for the practice to really consider. I believe that everyone should take some risk. I guess I'm a risk taker, but I'm somewhat conservative also. In certain parts of my life, I take some risk. You know, let's say an investment in the stock market, I've taken a little risk before, and hopefully I get the reward. In certain parts of my life, I'm somewhat conservative. In my business life, I am pretty conservative. But and that's the same way you have to look at it. In your practice, how much risk do you want to take when it comes to HIPAA compliance and patient data protection? You probably should take some, but how much should you take? And trying to find the right balance. What we're trying to do at PCI Hipaa is educate everyone on where your low-hanging fruit risk is and focus on that. Really focus on that, because our most valuable resource is time. That's our most valuable resource. Well, I'm over 50, so mine is really a lot of time. But I think we only have so much time in the day, and we have to figure out where are we going to spend it. And I believe some time should be spent in this area, but it has to be balanced. So I think it was important. Thanks for bringing that up, Danny. Hope that was clear. I hope the guy got that message that there is some risk. You have to consider it, but you also have to balance it and be practical about it. So let me talk about some risks, okay? And let me show you that this isn't just me getting up here and blowing smoke to you. This is real. That we see, that I read about this stuff every day because it's my job at running the company to understand what is happening in the environment and how do I protect my customers at the right level. And these are real headlines that I wanted to share. So just recently, a business associate agreement, which is required, and I'll get into as one of my tips, they didn't have it in place. A healthcare provider, they were fined $31,000 for not having a business associate agreement. Danny alluded to audits. Dentists and medical healthcare providers, they're getting audited. HIPAA's auditing them. They're doing desktop audits. They know that the industry hasn't responded to putting some of those safeguards in place that I discussed at the beginning, and I'll get into a little bit more in my presentation. They know that there's non-compliance and under-compliance in the industry. This is their way of banging the stick. So when they start publishing fines and they start saying they're going to go audit, it gets people to react, and we're seeing a lot more of that. Up at the top right, an IT service provider, $650,000. Your business associates, which is your IT provider, anyone that you're sharing patient information with, they also have risk, because with the omnibus rule, they now have to be HIPAA compliant. So your business associates that have your information, which protects you, they also have to be compliant. If they're not compliant, they're going to get fined. And then there's this other one around breach notification. If you have a breach and you don't respond to it, and a patient complains that their information was compromised in your hands, and you don't follow the proper HIPAA notification rules, that's setting yourself up for risk, financial risk and reputational risk. So you want to make sure that you're aligned with somebody, some type of professional that can walk you through, if you experience a breach, what to do. There's a laundry list of things that HIPAA requires. You have to notify them. You have to do a press release. You have to provide some support for your patients that may have been compromised. And there's ways to notify them, and there's different requirements in different states. And we want to make sure that our clients have someone, and that's what we do as part of ours, make sure that they're following the laws. And then the last one at the bottom here, which probably should be the biggest headline, is patient data that was held for ransom. So I don't know if you've heard, but we had a huge ransomware attack that happened last Friday. It hit over 150 countries. It hit over 200,000 individuals. And ransomware is an epidemic. And if you're not taking the proper precautions, you can fall into a lot of risk, because a ransomware attack is potentially a HIPAA violation. And if you're not prepared, you may have to pay a ransom, or you may not be able to get your data back in a worst case scenario. They may never unlock it. So, and we'll talk about ransomware. This isn't a ransomware webinar, but at some point we could probably do one. But I'm going to definitely touch upon it because of what happened, and I'm going to highlight in my tips of things that actually relate strictly to ransomware. Just real quickly, again, this is real. This practice, $100,000 fine, 5-doctor practice in Phoenix, they kind of just didn't do the basics. They posted a public calendar. That was the big problem, number one. They had a calendar online that had their patients could log in, and they could see when their appointment was and what their procedure was. So they put a little bit too much information online. It got into the wrong hands. They got a complaint. HIPAA came in, and they didn't have training procedures in place. They didn't have business associate agreements. They didn't have a HIPAA risk assessment, and they didn't identify a HIPAA officer. This kind of falls into the willful neglect area, and when you have willful neglect, fines can be up to $1.5 million, $25,000 a violation. I think it starts at 10 and it moves up. That's on the next slide here. So this is the fines for willful neglect at the bottom. So it's $10,000 and it's up to $1.5 million. And again, you have to show that you're doing something, and that falls into, okay, I'm not doing anything, I get it, but I want to now start to do something. I would say half of the practices that we speak with every day just haven't had the time and resources to do it. They had good intent, but they just never got around to it. They don't know where to start. Not knowing where to start now is no longer an excuse, because it's just the little things that can happen that could cause you some fines. This is another segment of risk. I want to touch upon this really quickly. So this is I don't know if you've heard of the iceberg example, but the iceberg is what you see on top is the iceberg. That's what we're all familiar with, but we don't see what's below the water line. And that's how big the iceberg is. And so in this analogy, the web is the top of the iceberg. This is what the web is. We go on websites. Yeah, there's some risk. We do some things on websites maybe that we should or shouldn't do. But they're definitely, for the most part, we're using the web in a way that we all see it. The bottom and below the iceberg below the waterline is the dark web. And the dark web are actual websites and actual businesses that do really, really bad things. And this is the reason why they go after your practice, or even, collude with your employees in other businesses, and maybe even your business, hopefully not, but I've seen it, where they will go out and get Social Security numbers, driver's licenses, credit card numbers, and they will sell it on the dark web. There's a huge market. It's a free-for-all for people of stealing and using data that they shouldn't have, but they steal it, they grab it, they sell it. And there's even businesses now that show people how to go in and create a ransomware attack, and how to go in and skim credit card data. And people pay for that information so that they can go do it. And
anybody who's interested, I just wanted to jump in briefly, Jeff. Anyone who's interested in maybe, I don't know if you really want to be, but there's a book that I read called Future Crimes, Inside the Digital Underground. and the Battle for Our Connected World by Mark Goodman. And he talks a lot about the dark web and everything you can think of, like dating sites and job sites. It's all duplicated in the underworld, the underweb world. Anything you can imagine is for sale, available. You can buy a hitman, from what I understand. So it's really frightening, and people need to really take this seriously because it's only getting bigger. And yeah, I mean, I didn't even have an idea. I thought there were some people that used the World Wide Web for nefarious purposes, but there's a whole huge other internet that I was never aware of. And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and just, you know, the reason why healthcare providers are targeted are two main reasons. One, you don't have sophisticated resources to protect your patient information, and they know that because you're just trying to treat patients and make money and go home to your families. You don't have a lot of time to really focus on this, and they know that. And that's just a fact. The second is that your patient information is worth a lot more than, let's say, a yogurt shop or a restaurant's information, because when they go into a yogurt shop, they're just going after that American Express card information that may be sitting in their point-of-sale system or in their credit card terminal. They don't have a driver's license or a social security number. You have all of it, and you have a birth date, and well, I guess that's on the driver's license, but you have all of it, and therefore your information is more valuable, and it leads to additional risk.
So it's a very liquid market for that information. It's just, you know, I think it was estimated that the average patient record is, at a minimum, can be sold for $250, and if you consider that the average dental office, whatever, 1,000 patients, you have more than that, the average. That's $250,000, and you know, theft doesn't disappear. It just looks for the locks that are easiest to pick. So rather than going after the big organizations, the hospitals that, as you mentioned earlier, they can afford a full-time HIPAA person. That's worth it for them, or they can justify it. The typical medical dental office can't, and so the criminals know that, and that's why these are prime targets.
Yeah, so I agree, and you're exactly right. It's being sold, they're worth money, and they're making money on it. So some common misconceptions, you may have these misconceptions, you may not, but the ones that we hear most often when we start talking about what we do and how we protect companies and our services is my IT guy handles it, my practice management software, my Dentrix software, my Patterson software, that's HIPAA compliant, so I don't really have to worry about it. HIPAA, SHMIPA, I talked about that. The people that just really don't care and they don't think there's any risk. My general liability policy will protect me. My office manager has it all covered. And I don't really have any risk. Well, again, just to touch upon what I just kind of sum it up, it's not just IT. It's not just those technical safeguards that you want to consider. There are real administrative and real physical safeguards that you also have to consider to make sure that you're compliant. You don't fall in that non-compliant zone. Just because your practice management software is compliant doesn't mean you are. And there's risk. There's definite risk, and you all have great office managers, and those office managers that are on the line, I applaud you. You take on a huge responsibility in the practice, but they also do not, first of all, most of them don't want to deal with this, and second, they don't have the bandwidth to run your practice and also stay on top of the safeguards and the requirements that are needed, and some of which are very, very practical. So let me now get into the 50 tips to protect your practice, and I'll set a little bit of context. So again, I could go into, and I used to do a presentation where I would go into the safeguards in detail at this point, and I just felt like, you know what, we run a very practical solution, and I want to go into what are things that I could share today that you can walk away with. That there's, and again, it's not going to be all 50, but there may be one or two things that you say, you know what, I'm going to do that today, and that is going to really protect me. Or I'm going to learn a couple things, and that's going to help me. That's my intent for the next, I don't know, however long this goes. But I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, And Danny, you could stop me if I'm not making sense or if I'm going too fast. I'm just going to glide through these fairly quickly, and then again, you're going to get a copy of these. You can take them with you. You can ask questions about something that doesn't make sense, and we'll just start now. So they're in no particular order. So assigning a HIPAA and security officer for your practice. Also, Danny, can you just let me know? I have the GoToWebinar. Okay, I want to move that.
Oh yeah,
So
people can't see that, but you see the orange box with the white arrow?
Yeah, I kind of tried doing that.
Click on that, and it'll collapse it for you.
Yeah, it's not doing that, but that's okay. That's okay. So let me just say that with the R in the upper right corner means that is a requirement of HIPAA. You have to have it in place. So assigning a HIPAA and security officer, I think this is really important, because if you don't have someone that you've assigned that actually is thinking about this, then you're just not going to get stuff done. So and that goes for anything in your practice. If you want to get something done, assign it to somebody and say, hey, it's your responsibility, do what you can. At least they're thinking about it. Not even having anyone assigned and having it written down and saying this person is my HIPAA security and privacy officer is just, basically saying that, we're not going to make much progress on it. You have to perform and document a HIPAA risk assessment. So just like you would assess your patients, you got to assess your risk and your HIPAA risk. I'm going to wait till the end of this presentation, so this will kind of keep you going, because Danny and his firm have sponsored a HIPAA risk assessment for you, and I will show you exactly what you need to do to go through it at a very practical level, so you can figure out what your risk is, and you can start to assess your own risk to see if you have it. But that's going to come towards the end. You need to document your compliance progress. Again, another requirement of HIPAA. This is important because if you're doing a bunch of things and not documenting the progress you're taking, then if you were ever audited, or if someone else came in and took your job, or you assigned it to somebody else, if there's no documentation, no one else could pick it up. But the most important part is really showing that you're making progress and that you care about compliance, and that you're showing that you're taking the steps and implementing the safeguards that are required under HIPAA. You need updated policies and procedures. We see a lot of practices that don't have anything in writing. They haven't updated policies and procedures. They don't even know what a policy and procedure is. It's very difficult to train employees on what they need to do if you don't have them in place. It's very easy to train them when you do. So you want to make sure that you have updated policies and procedures. And it's not just buying the ADA book and putting it on your shelf. It's actually having procedures that are customized for your practice, where you could say, okay, this is what my practice is doing, and you actually can take them out and use them and implement them throughout the practice. Two policies that are really important that I wanted to highlight are the acceptable use and sanction policies. The acceptable use policy documents to an employee, this is what you're allowed to do with our patient information, and this is what you're not allowed to do. And that's key, because once they start reading that, they start to get a mindset of, okay, I need to protect my doctor, I need to protect my practice, and if I don't, that's the sanction policy. If I don't, I'm going to be sanctioned. And you have to actually figure out what you're going to do to sanction employees. HIPAA wants to see that you're carrying your own stick. So their stick may be the audit, it may be the fines. Your stick is, I have a sanction policy in place, and the first thing we're going to do is you're going to get a verbal warning, second thing, a written warning, and third, you're out. And it's really important that you're following policies around protecting information. Train employees who have access to PHI and obtain acknowledgments. PHI means protected health information. Again, it's so important to train your employees on this. And it doesn't have to be someone who comes into your practice and spends a week and downloads a bunch of, information that they're going to forget. But it is important that you figure out what the most important pieces of protecting patient information are, and that your employees adhere to it and they acknowledge that they've gone through it. And so I'll just give you an example. For our program, it's all done online. We have videos that the employees can watch. They can take a couple quizzes, and then they can acknowledge that they've done that, and then they can read through all the policies and procedures. And again, that educates them, and it also shows that they're taking it seriously, and it also keeps track that, you know, any new employee that can come on board, that they're also acknowledging that they've gone through the training. Another thing is you need to know which employees are accessing your patient information and how are they getting to it. So with the proliferation of iPhones, iPads, tablets, workstations, how do employees access your patient information, and where are they going with it? What are they doing with it? And HIPAA wants to know, okay, who's accessing it, from where, and what rights have you given them? And you have to make sure that you've documented that. I want to make sure I did. Okay, this moves fast. You need to provide unique logins for your workforce members and not share them. We get many practices where they have 5 employees that have, you know, admin at drbroudy.com, and they use that to log into all their workstations. The problem with that is, if you have somebody that's not doing something that they shouldn't be doing, you have no trail on who's doing what. So it's actually a requirement that for every workstation that there's a separate login. All your practice management software should have a separate login. You shouldn't have, even interns, you shouldn't have them sharing logins. You want to make sure that they each have a separate one and that you can track it. You need to periodically review those reports for each workstation. It's not difficult if you have a good IT person, because I pull my login records all the time on my employees. I want to see who's logged in, how long they're on the internet. Tell me, in a second, I could ask my IT person, how long has Danny been on the internet and what sites is he visiting? These are the kinds of reports that you can pull easily, that your IT person should be able to pull if you have someone good, and that you can start to monitor a little bit. You don't have to spend a ton of time, but it does make sense to kind of do some spot checking on somebody to make sure that they're just not doing something stupid that could put you at risk. How do you access and think about your PHI during an emergency? So again, this is a requirement under HIPAA. They call it emergency and incident response planning. What would you do if there was a flood? What would you do if there was a fire? What would you do if there was a ransom attack and your data got encrypted? They want you to be proactive. It makes sense, but often practices just haven't had the time to do it. This is something that, you know, we kind of help practices through with some tools, but you want to know if there's a fire and you can't access your protected health information, what are you going to do? Or how are you going to access it? Or who's in charge of accessing if you can't get into the building? Because once you can't get into the building and you can't get a hold of that information, you can't treat patients. It's illegal for you to do that. And you need to make sure that you have access to those off-site and that there's ways that you can get access to it. And it just takes some thinking. It takes some alignment with your IT person, your office manager, and whoever else you want to put on that team. But you want to make sure you document, okay, how are you backing up? How are you restoring your data? And how are you going to operate during an emergency? Business associate agreements. This is key, because a business associate is anyone that's handling your information that is not an employee or not another doctor. So this could be your IT provider. This could be a third-party administrator. This could be a CPA. This could be a law firm. This could be someone who you're sharing it with for marketing to do some market analysis for you. They are required to safeguard your information, and you are required to have a business associate agreement with them. The most important part of a business associate agreement is that you receive indemnification. And that's the most critical piece. And what indemnification means is that if I share my information with my IT provider and they are careless and they haven't implemented the safeguards, they're going to indemnify me for any loss that I have because of their mistreatment of my information. And so you want to make sure you have those agreements in place, and you want to make sure they're signed, and you want to make sure that you're protected and it has that indemnification clause. I mentioned this. You don't need business associate agreements with your employees, and you don't need business associate agreements with healthcare providers because they're covered under other jurisdiction, and obviously other healthcare providers are they're governed under HIPAA, so they need to have those safeguards in place. If you dispose of your PHI, make sure it's in an unreadable manner. So if you're getting rid of a laptop, make sure that there's not information that's sitting on there when you get rid of it, because if it gets in the wrong hands, they'll do something with it. They'll sell it, they'll find it, they'll create identity theft, and you need to make sure that you have a policy in place that when you're upgrading your computers, when you're doing something, that you're disposing of it in the right place. The right way, I should say, not the right place. Notice of privacy, I'm going to touch a little bit on privacy here. Everyone needs a notice of privacy policy. You have to have it updated. This defines for your patients what you can do with their information. You have to provide it to the patient on their first visit. You have to put it on your website, and it has to be visible in your practice somewhere, and you need to make sure that you get an acknowledgement from your patients that they've had a chance to read it. This is just, again, an administrative requirement under the privacy rule, and it's important that you follow it. This is a big one, and I know this seems very logical, but I see fines on this all the time. You can't share information without their authorization. And what I'm seeing, I just read this the other day, there was a fine yesterday where a doctor shared patient information with a patient's new employer. So the employer called the doctor and said, "Hey, do you have any information on Danny Bobrow?" And the practice sent it. That's a HIPAA violation. Can't do that. Patient has to provide authorization to do that. And again, that's in the notice of privacy practices. They have to be up to date, and you got to be really careful on who you're sharing it with. But that, in this case, the practice shared HIV information, and they had a huge fine. I know it sounds ridiculous, but this stuff happens all the time. It's okay to share patient information without consent for treatment or to collect payment. So you don't need a patient's authorization if you're, from your payment processor, or if you're sharing information to collect from an insurance company, if it's relating to collecting payment. You don't need consent for treatment. So HIPAA is not trying to inhibit you from treating patients. They just want to make sure that you're protecting them from just giving out their information to someone who shouldn't have it. But they don't want to interfere with the treatment. So if it's another physician, if it's a lab, you don't need to receive authorizations for treatment. Implement the no gossip rule in your practice. People should not be talking about other patients. They shouldn't be gossiping about other patients. This is what leads to fines. And it's not an audit that leads to it. Here's what I see. Here's the trail. A patient hears something, they see something, they get upset, they go online to the Health and Human Services, they file a complaint, the Health and Human Services reaches out, and then they say, okay, at the time of the complaint, what did you have in place? Did you have your notice of privacy policies? Have you trained employees? Did you have these business associate agreements? And if they don't see you doing anything, that's where the risk happens. The risk of getting audited, quite frankly, I'm not going to sit here and scare you. It's like the risk of getting audited by the IRS. It's there. I know it's there. So I'm going to file my tax return, and I'm going to do it right. But I'm not going to just turn my head to it, and I'm not going to just not file my tax return. It's important that you're doing something, because if something happens and it's not just an audit, they're going to look to see what you've done. But again, educating employees on what they can and can't say in the office is worth a conversation. It's worth a staff meeting. Don't share your patient photos or information on your website or social media without the patient consent. I'm seeing a lot of this. We're saying, hey, this is one of our favorite patients, and they had a great experience. Let's put it on our Facebook page. Can't do that unless you get their consent. So
yeah, that's a really important point, Jeff, and obviously what's motivating that is a desire to satisfy Google, to help with search rankings and the recognition of the power of social media when you're posting reviews and patient testimonial videos. My company, of course, is a big advocate of that, but there is a smart and a HIPAA compliant way to do that. And so I'll just quickly mention that if you are doing that without getting the proper disclaimers or authorizations, then you should suspend for a while, and I'm happy to talk to you about it, because there are some really simple automated ways to do it. because I know that it's kind of like spoils the moment when you say, well, hold on, before we do that, let me just pull out this 2-page authorization or waiver form. So very important, and I'm sure there's a lot of this going on. So thanks for mentioning that as one of your tips.
Be careful with new employees. You're not a lot. We get this question: when I hire somebody new, am I required to do a background check? Is that required under HIPAA? There's nothing in HIPAA that says you have to do a background check, but HIPAA does say you have to know who you're hiring, and you have to have an understanding of their background. A background check is a really good idea, but we've had. I'll just give you a little example. Again, I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to just make you think about certain things. Maybe you think about an employee. It may not even be a new employee. It could be someone who's been existing. But here's what happened. They came in. In this case, they were new, and they took patient information, and they used that patient information to create different identities. They used the patient's identity, and they created, different accounts at an electronics store. So they went into, I think it was Best Buy, and they started to have people go in and really easily create a line of credit, and they started just going in and buying equipment on that line of credit. And you could easily do that online. You could do that anywhere if you have the information. And employees that come from the wrong side of the tracks, they will take advantage once they see an opportunity. And again, I put new employees in here because employees that have been around a long time and nothing's happened, probably don't deserve the scrutiny. But you just have to build some awareness on possibly what can be happening just because the information you carry is valuable and it's easy to create identity theft with it. Here's my little ransomware logo. I put these on certain slides because these are tips to help your practice not get hit with a ransomware attack that happened over the weekend. I'm not saying that by doing this you're guaranteed, but you're going in the right direction by thinking about it. So when you see this little thing, I'll touch upon ransomware. So training employees on the danger of downloads. Downloading is probably the #1 cause through email of a ransomware attack. And what happens is we all have received that email potentially of, hey, you haven't paid this invoice, or hey, download this for your free certificate to Amazon. And what happens is it looks very genuine, but when it gets downloaded, it automatically triggers things that happen in the system. And once it does that, it starts to infiltrate through your system, and then it locks it down, and then you're encrypted and you have to pay a ransom. And a lot of it happens from phishing emails, from downloads. And so it's not too difficult to go online and find a couple phishing emails that are examples, and again, have that staff training and say, don't do this. Don't download anything unless you know exactly who it's from and it's something that we need to do.
And the problem, as you know, Jeff, is that the criminals are getting better and better at counterfeiting and pretending to be legitimate emails with logos and layout and format. One way to protect yourself is to hover over the link and take a look at the URL, because often it'll say Amazon, but there'll be like an e.amazon or Amazon S or something that to the busy person's eye looks legitimate. But if you stop and take your time and look at it, there's usually something wrong with the link. And I'm not sure that that's sufficient. They may even know how to make the link look correctly. I don't know. That's probably the next level.
They're getting good, and they're getting good, but usually it comes from someone that you're just not sure of, or something unique. And just having that education to double check, and how do you raise your hand? What should you do? What should you look for? And how do we escalate it is really important. This is a tough one, but I would recommend don't allow workstations for personal use. So yeah, we all have employees. They all want to, be able to check their email, or they all want to go on Facebook, but I just wouldn't allow it, especially workstations that have any access to PHI. So I would just separate the two as much as you can. That will protect you from an employee error. make a bigger deal about passwords if you haven't. Believe it or not, ASDFGHJKL semicolon is probably still one of the #1 passwords used. And guess who knows that? They know it. And they can hack into a system, again, through a phishing email, and now they have a password, and they start using these passwords to get into crazy places. And this is how they get in. They get in with weak passwords. So passwords are a big deal. And make sure that they're being changed, every few months, and make sure, they're containing numbers and symbols, and make them difficult, and stop with the, ASDF or your first and last name or Google 123. Yeah, 1234. All the ones I could send you a link of the 10 worst passwords, and believe me, people are still using them. So make a bigger deal about that. I think I talked
Jeff,
about.
Do you have an opinion about these? I forgot what they're even called. They sound like password aggregators, where you can have all your passwords stored online at one site. I mean, my sense is that anything can be hacked, and that's just the treasure trove, and the hackers know that would be a great site to hack into. So I've never used one, but do you have an opinion on them?
I've never used it. I don't want to badmouth them. I haven't heard a lot of news on one of them getting hacked and passwords going out, but my guess is that could happen. Sometimes if it's too easy, there's a reason for it. So there's probably better ways.
What I do is I'll periodically change my passwords. I have a certain pattern, and I'll just change because it's easy to remember then. And I also have a database where I'll store it. But, like if I have a combinations of letters and numbers and they're going in a certain sequence, either descending, ascending, or every other or something, I know what the pattern is. So when I want to change it, I just sort of move down the sequence. So it's still a pretty robust password, but it's one that I can remember if it's lost, or I can easily update it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of great strategies, but in your practice, I would definitely make a big deal about it, and make sure you have a procedure in place, and that your IT or someone, again, maybe your HIPAA security officer owns updating those, especially for those software access to your patient information. I think we drilled upon this enough. Don't open emails from strangers. Pretty basic. Here's some just tidbits. It's okay to use check-in sheets. Everyone was like, "Oh, HIPAA, you can't use check-in sheets. You can't put the person's name on it. You got to, you could use check-in sheets. You could put the person's name on it. Just the rule about HIPAA is it's called a minimum necessary rule, and basically that means that you have to use the minimum necessary information to get something done. So for an example, on a check-in sheet, it's not Danny Bobrow is here for X, Y, and Z, P, D, and Q. It's Danny Bobrow and maybe the time, and that's it. And you're allowed to use somebody's name, that's fine. You just don't want to put their procedure or anything else that you really don't need to in a check-in sheet. It's okay to call or text for appointment confirmation. This was another one we get. Are we allowed to do that? We can't text anymore. We're not allowed to text. We're not allowed to confirm. No, you're allowed to. You got to be able to run your business, but just be smart about it. Be practical, and don't share information that you really don't need to in those appointment confirmations. Even if you're doing it by phone, you don't want to say, "Hey, Danny, we're calling about X, Y, and Z appointment," or to do the X, Y, and Z, because someone else might be listening besides Danny, and then he didn't tell anyone that he had that, and then it starts to lead to some frustration. Use a password or a PIN on your mobile device. I think this is pretty basic, but just a reminder: those mobile devices can get stolen, they get lost, they get in the wrong hands. The screensaver doesn't go on, and sometimes there's information on it that patients can see, and you just got to be careful where they are and what they're doing, as well as your employees. I would enable wiping and disabling to erase data on mobile devices. There are, on all the devices, there are Find Your Phone and other similar types of settings where if you lose your mobile phone, you can wipe the information by just clicking, by going on your site. For example, on Apple, you can just go onto your site, go into your settings, go into Find Your Phone, and you could wipe out all that information. So if it does get in the wrong hands and you have PHI on it, that you can disable it and make sure that they don't get access to it. And when you're able to do that, it also helps you from not having to notify patients, which is the last thing you want to have to do. You don't want to get stuck in a situation where you have to notify patients because of something that happens in your practice, because that opens you up for, again, financial and reputational risk. So you want to make sure you're taking care of your mobile phones and disabling that. Public Wi-Fi is an open net for crime. They can easily get access to your system. I would not go, especially when you're dealing with protected health information, I would not log into your practice management software or your network from a public Wi-Fi. I know you want to sit in Starbucks, and I know it's easy there, or somebody does. I wouldn't do it. I would use a VPN instead. It's a lot more secure, and you can talk to your IT provider about it. But we read about this all the time, where public Wi-Fi gets hacked in hotel rooms, in Starbucks, and they can start seeing your keystrokes, believe it or not, and then they can start accessing your system. Delete all stored information. I already talked about this. Make sure it's wiped out, and well, I talked about it a little bit if you lose it. But if you're actually discarding it, and let's say you're going to get a new iPhone at Apple, which my daughter just wanted, I'm like, no way, you just got one. Why do you need another one? But if you're going to go and you want the next iPhone 8 and you want to turn yours in because you want the upgrade and you're due for an upgrade, you got to make sure that your information that you have on there is discarded, especially in healthcare. So just make sure that you've wiped it all out before you get, sometimes they give rebates or whatever. You want to make sure all that information is off it. Laptops are they have on hhs.gov or .org. It's a great resource for us about HIPAA and requirements and tips. They have this website on it we call it the Hall of Shame. It's where every data breach is reported, and every single day I read about another laptop that's stolen that has patient information on it, and it wasn't encrypted. We had a customer that lost 4,500 records on a laptop. Laptops get stolen. We have clients that back up data on laptops, and then their car gets stolen, and the laptop's in the car. I can't tell you how much of a risk the laptop is. I'm not saying don't use it, but what I'm saying is make sure that you're protecting it. Don't store any patient information on it. Don't store any login information of how to get into your all your passwords. We had this happen also, where there was an Excel file. It had all their login information. The laptop got stolen. Patient names were on it. It wasn't encrypted. It was a nightmare. So be really extra careful with anyone that has a laptop in your office, and make sure it's secure, and ask your IT person, how do I make sure that my data is encrypted on it, and don't store any patient information on your laptop. Don't text unless it's secure. So texting, you can text, you could use text, just make sure it's secure and make sure you're using a network that's secure. It's okay to text patients, and I know it's going in this direction. I mean, all of our youth, my kids, even myself, I'm starting to text more and more. It's human nature. So that's not going to stop. That trend's not going to stop. We're going to continue to text more and more. We're going to continue to start to prefer texting, and your patients may start to prefer texting over calling and over having a dialogue, or even over email. You just have to make sure, okay, how should I protect my information to make sure it's going through a secure network? And there's special texting networks that are protected. And if you're gonna send patient information or procedural information or anything over text, you have to make it secure. And the challenge sometimes with texting is it's very easy to send it to the wrong person. So you're going through and it's Danny Jones instead of Danny Jones Jr., or you have 6 different Smiths in your Rolodex and you send one to the wrong Smith. That's a HIPAA violation. You just violated HIPAA if you sent protected health information through that device. So yes, you could use it, but you got to be careful, and you have to start putting in policy and procedure in place to make sure that you're protecting your patient information as you're doing it. Backups are key. So again, you want to make sure that you're backing off your data, you're backing up your data offsite, and you want to use encryption. Our solution uses point-to-point encryption. Once it leaves our practice's network, it's encrypted. Once it goes in the cloud, it's encrypted. You need to make sure that it's encrypted and that you can restore it in case there's an emergency. But this is a big thing. You don't want to keep it on a network. You don't want to keep it on a thumb drive. Backing up and restoring data is critical. And you want to keep multiple backup sets. And again, this is what protects yourself from having to pay a ransom. So for example, if you got hit with a ransom attack and your data is encrypted and you have one set of data and then you copy it, guess what? The one you just copied is now encrypted and you don't have a set to restore. So, but if you keep multiple days of it, we actually keep 10 consecutive days and then 1 month, so that if your data, if for whatever reason that data set gets backed up and overwritten, you have 9 other days that you can restore. And if you need the ability to restore data so that you don't have to pay the ransom. If you can't restore your data and it's encrypted and you didn't back it up for a month or 2 or 3 or longer, or you haven't been backing it up and you can't restore it or you don't know how to restore it, then you're forced to pay the ransom, and then you don't even know if they're going to decrypt the data for you. And that's what, that's one of the risks for ransomware. This is one of the cures, not to get hacked, but to be able to restore your practice and get it up and running quickly. You want to make sure if you have an event and someone goes in and you can't get a hold of your data or it's encrypted, that you're able to restore it and you're able to start treating patients as soon as possible, and that you understand what your restoration process is. Because it's never about the backup procedure. It's always about the restoration. And you want to make sure you're talking to the people that are responsible for your data and backing it up, that you can restore it. Workstation timeouts, you got to make sure that people just can't walk through the office and they see something that they shouldn't be seeing. Make sure your timeouts are set for 2 to 5 minutes. Stop using Gmail, AOL, and Yahoo. These are free for a reason. They use your data in your email to target, advertise your patients. Believe me, that's why it's free. And you really want to get on an Exchange server. You really want to develop. You really want to get an email filtering system so that it actually stops those phishing emails from getting into your clients or into your employees' inbox. It's really, really important. I can't stress enough. And I also think it looks unprofessional when a doctor or a practice has, Broudy at Gmail 12304 dot, because my name's already been used, so they can't, and it's at gmail.com. I just don't think it looks professional. I think you should get your own domain. I think you should get your own email server. It's not that much money, and it really makes you look more professional, and you can protect yourself.
Yeah, and that's an essential element of branding too. Your email addresses really should be your name or info or front desk at mydentalpractice.com. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not working through Google, though, because it just is an alias forwarder, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can access. No, you just don't want. I wouldn't use the Gmail account or the AOL
at
account.
all.
Yeah, I would get your own domain, and through GoDaddy, and then I would use that or some other domain, but I wouldn't use the free services. I think the free services. I had three clients this week that their Gmail account got hacked, and the invoice email went out to all their patients or whoever was in their Gmail account. It's just they get hacked, and we've seen it, and just that's an area I would definitely look at. If you are using it, and even if you're using Outlook or even if you have your own domain, if you're sending patient information, make sure it's encrypted, because if it's encrypted and something happens to it on the other end, it's not your responsibility. You can say that it got sent through an encrypted format, and there's no notification requirement. If it's not encrypted, then you don't know what can happen to it. You don't know who gets it. There's no tracking system. There's very simple encrypted email solutions out there where you put in a password, you encrypt the patient information, and you send it in an encrypted format. Even Microsoft has an encrypted solution that can send it through Outlook. We use a separate solution called SendInk that makes it easy for our practices to do it. But it's important that you're just not sending out patient information that's not encrypted. Again, anything with PHI, red flag, make sure you know where it's going, where it's not. Update your firewall with your IT provider. This helps protect your network. You want to make sure they're always updated. It's really important. Lock up all your papers. Know who has access to them. All your paper records, those files. This is pretty standard, but sometimes practices forget. So the most important part is who's going in and out of those files, and do you have records, and are you locking them up, and who has those keys? Copiers and fax machines, we just had a practice. They weren't aware that when they got a fax, it got stored in the fax machine, and guess what? Someone came in, they downloaded all of it, and it had a bunch of PHI on it, and we had to do a forensic investigation, and then we had to notify patients of they had faxes back for months. And so we had another practice that had a copy machine, and they turned it in, and they forgot that the copy machine store information. So just make sure that your copiers and your fax machines, it's okay to store it if you're using it and you need to use it to run your practice, but you have to make sure you delete that information. Don't let it just sit there because it's PHI, and if it gets in the wrong hands, it could be a compromise. Be extremely careful with web-based services like calendars and appointments. Some of those are really great, but again, they're on the web and they can get accessed by other people. I think the most important thing here is just be careful what you put in those calendars and appointments if you're using them. Again, it's okay to use names. It's not okay to put names and birth dates and phone numbers and procedures and all this stuff that's very sensitive that you need to protect. I would stop using thumb drives. Just don't do it. Someone loses the thumb drive, especially if it's not encrypted, and it gets stolen, that's a HIPAA violation, and you have to notify all the patients. It's so easy to lose a thumb drive. It's so easy for someone to download information they shouldn't be with a thumb drive. Those things are really cool when they first came out. I loved them. Hey, I got a drive. I can just plug it in and download stuff. Well, guess what? There's so much more risk than it's worth. So I just would stop using them and start figuring out how to back up your data in a cloud environment. It's okay to have a hard drive. That we have a lot of practices that have hard drives because they're backing up X-rays and there's a lot of data. But make sure that those hard drives are encrypted, because the most important part is that you have encryption when you're backing up data. You must have encryption. This is a big one. The reason why everyone got infiltrated with the ransomware attack over the weekend is because their Windows operating system was not up to date. And they know it. There's a lot of entities out there, not just healthcare, but a lot of entities out there that are on old Windows operating systems like Windows XP. Windows XP isn't even supported by Windows anymore, by Microsoft. So if you're on Windows, make sure that you've enabled the automatic updates and that those patches are being updated. If you had those patches updated and once the ransomware attack came out, if your operating system was updated, you would have never gotten hit. And there were, again, hundreds of thousands that got hit because they did not update their operating system, and their antivirus software wasn't up to date either. So make sure those are up to date. Make sure you're using an SSL certified secure sockets layer on your website. And if you go on websites and you're exchanging any kind of patient information or credit card information or whatever you're shopping, make sure that site has a secure HTTPS on it. If there's no secure symbol, it's not a secure site. You got to make sure yours is, especially if you're sharing any information or if you're getting paid on it or anything. You want to make sure that your site's secure, and you also want to make sure that if you're shopping or if you're doing anything or sharing it on a portal or anything, that website is also secure and that it's certified. You should obtain HIPAA data breach protection. This is the reason why this is important for ransomware is if you have a ransomware attack, it could be considered a HIPAA violation. If it's a HIPAA violation, then there's a lot of things you need to do to notify patients. There's costs involved. There's potential audits and follow-up and fines. There is HIPAA data breach protection out there that you can. That's one of the first things you can do very quickly is get that protection. And that's really important because you may not dot all the I's and cross all the T's, but if you have at least an umbrella, what we do in our program is every one of our practices that sign up, they get $100,000 right off the bat on day one. And what we say is, look, it goes back to that risk mitigation. You may not be able to do everything. You're not going to be able to dot all the I's and cross the T's because you need to treat patients. But we're going to get you there. And God forbid something does happen, if you get audited or if you get fined, at least you have the protection. You have $100,000 and $200,000 for a PCI violation. This isn't covered under your general liability policy. Your general liability policy does not cover a HIPAA fine or notification costs. So there's things that you can do for not a lot of money to get some coverage for you, just in case there's that audit or just in case there is that data breach and something does happen. EMV, so when you accept credit cards, make sure you're on an EMV device. That is a requirement now under the Payment Card Industry Association. You have to make sure that, that little chip, that it's all going to the chip. There's no more swiping. It's all about the chip. If you don't have, if one of your patients uses a chip and they have a credit card that has a chip and you're unable to accept that chip, you're exposed for a chargeback. Meaning, and we see this, believe it or not, we have patients, they know that they can charge back a fee if they have a chip on their card and the practice swipe the card instead. That they can actually charge that back. And the liability used to go to the bank and the processor. It now goes to the practice. So make sure you're using EMV when accepting credit cards, and make sure you have a certificate. So there's a lot of processors that are charging for non-compliance fees for credit card processing. They actually charge for PCI compliance fees, and then they charge for non-compliance fees. And it is a revenue center. And one of the first things we do is we look at the statement and say, look, get a certificate. It's easy. All you need to do is do a scan of your IP address and fill out an SAQ, a self-assessment questionnaire. You will get a certificate. You get the certificate. That's how our business started. We help practices get certificates so that they can eliminate that cost. And usually they're eliminating, $29, $30 at least a month right off the top by getting a certificate and not paying non-compliance fees. And the last thing I want to say about credit card processing, because I've been in it for 20 years, and we started with PCI, and then we got into HIPAA. That's why it's PCI HIPAA. Not the greatest name, but it is what it is. But the PCI piece is don't lease credit card equipment. It's a ripoff. People take advantage of businesses by leasing equipment. There's no reason to lease any equipment. You can get it for free anywhere, and it's like the razor blade and the razor. People are going to give you the razor to get, and they're going to charge you for the razor blades. And that's the same thing. The credit card's the razor. You can get that equipment all day long. You can get really good EMV equipment, and you shouldn't be leasing it or paying for it. Don't pay those non-compliance fees. There's no reason. And don't pay over 2.5% for credit card processing. You're a healthcare provider. You're a very the reason why fees are high in the credit card industry is because it's risky. Yep. But you don't have a risky business. You have a very non-risk business because you know your patient. So if you take it, all you need to do is pull out your statement, look at how much fees you paid, and divide it by the volume, and make sure it's at 2.5% or lower. That's when you know you're in the right area, and that's a fair price to pay. Anything above that, and we see clients paying 3% or more, they're just getting ripped off by their processor. And it's worth it to just kind of take a look at it. You can save some money really quickly. When in doubt, ask a professional or go to hhs.gov. This is the Health and Human, I'd say God. It's not God. They're just the Health and Human Services. HHS. Yeah, they think they are. It's actually a good site. We use it as a tool. If you have questions, you could always go there, but you can always email Danny because he knows everything too. So we'll give you his email address or mine. And I'm going to leave you. So those were the 50, believe it or not. I'm at an hour and 15 minutes. So
record time. Well done.
I want to leave you actually on. I hope, first of all, I hope you got something out of this. I know we went fast. I know I was talking about, and I don't. Again, the purpose wasn't for me to get on a soapbox and say you got to do this, that, or the other. the purpose for me and the reason why I love doing these kind of webinars is I feel like as long as you take away one or two things, hopefully that'll help you down the line. It'll protect your practice. I have a lot of admiration for the medical industry. My father-in-law was an ophthalmologist. My dad worked in the medical industry, and my wife is a hypochondriac. So I am very tied into the medical industry, and I admire you and what we want to do. And our passion at PCI HIPAA is to help practices mitigate risk at a fair price. And this is one of the examples. So every one of you is required to take a risk assessment. It's part of the HIPAA security rule. You have to be able to understand where your liabilities are. A lot of them have to do with the things I talked about, like do you have business associate agreements? Have you identified an officer? Do you have an emergency plan in place? This assessment is just like when you do an assessment before you treat your patients. You've got to kind of understand where you're at. And AIM Marketing has been kind enough to sponsor a risk assessment for every attendee that is on the phone today. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that you at least go and take the assessment. And you can take it online. And Danny, we're gonna send them the PDF so they can just click on this and do it.
That's right. You don't have
yeah.
to worry about jotting down or much less memorizing this URL. We will get that to you. And note, it will be secure. It has an HTTPS there on it.
Right. And so at least we got that right. So then so there's an assessment. There's an assessment. It's 42 questions. It's yes or no. On the front page, we're going to ask you for a little bit of information. You can use the code webinar, which is also on the first page. When you get done with those 42 questions, you get a risk score right away. So you will understand where you are between 0 and 100. Most of our practices that take this are under 70. So don't feel badly, because HIPAA, again, doesn't do a great job of telling you exactly what to do, but this gives you an idea of where you sit. And then there's also an opportunity, and Danny has sponsored this also, to review your risk report with a risk advisor. And it's a 30-minute review. We'll go over your risk score. We'll go over your report. We'll send you the report. It's mandatory anyway, okay? So even if the worst thing that happens is you take it, you get a score, and you get a review, yeah, we're gonna talk about some of the ways to mitigate some of your risk, but you'll get your report, and you can decide whether you want to do something with it or not. The whole purpose and what we're trying to provide here is an opportunity for you to take the risk assessment, kind of see of those 50 tips where you are and where you're not, get a risk score, get a 23-page report. Just in case you got audited, you can say, hey, we took this report, and then talk to one of our risk advisors. And if you want to mitigate some of your risk quickly and you feel what we're doing is fair and can help the practice, then great, you can sign up for our program. There's no requirement to do that. This is usually a $599 expense that Danny has sponsored for everyone that's attended the webinar. So I think that's all I got. Danny, do you want to add anything else? Hopefully this was it didn't seem like too long, and it was informative for everybody.
Well, I hope I speak for everybody else. I think it flew by. I appreciate, obviously, I've heard you speak before, and it's why I invited you on. I knew you had a great deal of valuable material to share. I'm glad that you also mentioned the fact, it is a fact, that a risk assessment is mandatory, and so simply by taking that, I think at least you're on your way to demonstrating intent and a plan should the unfortunate happen that you are audited. But it really opened my eyes. It's opened up a number of my clients' eyes, and that's why I was so excited about having you come on board. Regardless of your name, it certainly says what you do, and that sort of reminded me, for those of you who remember the Smucker's commercials, with a name like PCI HIPAA, they've got to be good, right? And the only other thing I would mention, Jeff, because I can't resist, is that you may want to check. Your wife may not be a hypochondriac. She might just be sick of you.
Yeah. Well, it's been a lot of years.
Yeah, it has. Maybe it's time for a risk assessment, a personal risk assessment. But seriously,
there
there are
questions. Okay,
There
there
are
are.
indeed. The first one I wanted to ask you is, does HIPAA actually give a certification?
No, they don't. PCI does, but HIPAA does not. There's no certification, so you just have to continue to show a culture of compliance. There's no paper that you will receive from HIPAA, but a lot of documentation, a lot of progress, doing those things that I was talking about will get you well on your way. But no, there's no certification.
Okay. And next is we're on the cloud for our dental software. Can you tell me exactly what I need to get from them to keep on hand at the office, stating that our patient files are encrypted on their end? We also have an IT person who does all of our backing up of files. Is this the same information I am needing from them that I need to keep on file in the office?
So I would, on both accounts, since they're handling your patient information, I would get business associate agreements. Again, that protects you from the indemnity of anything that's not in their hands. And then I would just ask them, I think the question you should be asking is, if something were to happen, how do I restore my data? How are you going to restore it for me? What would we do? Are you going to send me a hard drive? Is it just a download? How hard is it to do? Am I in multiple locations? You want to get an idea of how they're going to restore that information. If you get a business associate agreement with them, you're protected if something were to happen. But I think practically, you want to make sure that you can ask them about their encryption and make sure that's protected. Most practice management softwares have an encrypted data backup, and they're storing it in an encrypted way, but you may want to check with the provider that is providing it for you. But I believe the most important thing, aside from them protecting it, just the basics, is that you need to be able to restore it if something were to happen to them. How are they going to restore all of the information that they have in the cloud? How difficult is it? And maybe have your IT provider by your side to listen to that answer and make you feel comfortable that, create the scenario for them. Tell them, look, here's what happened. Here's what could happen. There's a fire at your facility. Do you have, especially if you're relying on them to put it in the cloud, do they have multiple data centers, a duplicated data center, so that how would they get your data? And just make sure that those answers sound reasonable to you and your IT provider.
Very good. Next question is, how does data breach coverage work?
So there's different types. I'll speak to ours, and then I'll speak to another type. So the way ours works is, because we have a compliance program that consists of, administrative safeguards and technical safeguards, and we take the practice through our Office Safe portal and all of that, we've been able to underwrite coverage for every one of our clients. There's no underwriting requirement. Once they sign up with our program, they get the coverage, and you have it. And the way it works is, if there's a breach, we become your incident response team, and our coverage covers notification costs and fines related to that breach. So you have to notify the Health and Human Services, you have to notify patients, you have to do a press release, you have to make sure. We also have $1 million in coverage for identity monitoring for each one of your patients. It's all covered in that, and we, you can continue to practice, and we become the incident response team, and my team helps with any kind of data breach, including creating FAQs for your patients in case that happens. That's one type of coverage. Another type of coverage is getting cyber insurance, and we've all heard about cyber insurance. It's a lot more expensive. What it does add in their coverage is usually the coverage limits are a little higher, and also it covers any third party. So if patients were to do a class action lawsuit, some of the policies cover that. And it all goes to the risk mitigation play. How much money do you want to spend to mitigate your risk? For what we offer, our program is $199 a month for a lot of services, and including the coverage. We try to get practices getting from zero protection, or the ones that are like below 70 and they don't have a lot of coverage, to just get them covered and mitigate that risk quickly at a very fair price. Cyber, and they don't really, the cyber companies, they have coverage, but they don't really help you with HIPAA. They don't become your incident response team. You still have to do that yourself. But so those are two differences and a little bit about how that works.
Very good. Let's just keep moving because we've got several questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to them all. But next is, how can my employees be trained on this?
So again, I'll go through. I went through it briefly. I'll just touch upon it again. There are companies that just do HIPAA training. That's not our philosophy. We feel like let companies do what they do best, which is treating patients, and we do it all virtually. So we have videos that employees can watch. We have quizzes that employees can take, and that the HIPAA officers can see what they score. We have acknowledgments that they go through the training, and it all gets stored, and it all gets automated, and it's all done via email and automation. But I think, there's some practices like to have a meeting. We have a lot of resources on our portal for PowerPoint presentations and videos and quizzes, and they can have a group discussion. We're constantly getting feedback from our practices to develop more and more, but it's our belief that it can all be done virtually. You don't need to bring people in, and people tend, when they learn too much over a short period of time, which a lot of the trainers do in the HIPAA world, it gets forgotten. Now, training the trainer is not a bad idea. If the HIPAA security officer wants to get trained or go out and get trained and then come back and train the office, they can do that. So I think there's two ways of thinking about it. One is, have someone come in and I want hand holding and face-to-face, and one is, let me just do it virtually and let my employees, maybe have one meeting, and then I'll tell them what to go do, and then they can go review the policies and procedures, watch the videos, take the quizzes, and then show the documentation that the practice is taking a position on it and moving towards that culture of compliance.
Well, that's good. So in addition to the training, which you make simple, you also document it so that the team, the practice, can share that with the authorities, if need be, to demonstrate their compliance and commitment to compliance. Excellent. Next question, does my IT provider have to be HIPAA compliant?
If your IT provider handles patient health information, protected health information, they have to be compliant. They have to follow HIPAA just like you. So under the Omnibus rule in 2013, HIPAA expanded who is required to be HIPAA compliant, and it includes anyone that you share information with, which is your business associate, which is your IT provider, if you provide that information to them.
Okay. Time for just one more question. If I am PCI compliant, am I HIPAA compliant?
No, you're not. A PCI violation is a HIPAA violation, so you can be PCI compliant, but that doesn't mean you're HIPAA compliant, because PCI is just covering your payment environment. Now, you will get a certification if you're PCI compliant, but that does not mean you're HIPAA compliant. Remember, we went through those safeguards,
yep.
Administrative, technical, and physical, and some of it overlaps, but not all of it. There's a lot more that you need to do.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, we're going to have to end the questions at that point. I want to thank you again, and just remind everybody that in a few days you're going to receive an email with instructions on how to receive your 1.5 hours of PACE-approved CE credit. And now I want to invite you to please mark your calendars for our next webcast, which will be on Wednesday, June 25th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time, when my very special guest will be Mr. Clay Jacobson, who will deliver unscheduled treatment, the low-hanging fruit of your dental practice. In any successful organization, as you know, effective follow-up can often mean the difference between mediocre and great, and your dental practice is no different. No matter how great you and your team are at presenting treatment, there will always be some patients who can't or won't make a decision that same day. Dental professionals spend a lot of money and time making sure they know the best practices when it comes to presenting treatment. But after the work is done and the patient leaves, there can also often be a lot of low-hanging fruit left on the branch. So this presentation will show you how to save time, increase treatment acceptance, and dramatically improve the ROI in your practice with easy-to-implement tactics presented by one of the true rising stars today in the business of dentistry. That date and time, again, are Wednesday, June 25th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. Until then, this is Danny Bobrow, thanking you for your continued commitment to practice perfection, and once again, thanking my good friend Jeff Broudy for the great information today and the generous offer for the risk assessment. Thank you again, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
and
Andy.
goodbye, everybody. Good luck. Bye-bye.